Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Future of XYZ. I am thrilled to be joined by my friend and former client, Chris Walker of Sav Media. Chris, welcome to the show.
Hey, nice to meet everyone. Hey, Lisa, nice to see you.
Nice to see you. I know that there are lots of things that we've been exploring we could talk about, but what we landed on that we want to talk about really, I think, is the heart of what you have gone after, which is the future of fandom and what fandom actually means. I want to get into, as well as why it matters to you, given your background, both as a brand strategist and creative director, but also originating as a colorist at DC Comics and a comic book designer, author, creator yourself. So I'd love to just start with what is fandom? I think it's an important one.
Sure. I think when people think about fandom, there's a couple of different ways the word is rooted in fanatic, right? So that idea that you like something so much that you're kind of taken to this different space. I think, other times people think about fans, they think about either sports fans or music fans, comic book fans. So again, that kind of fandom kind of brought in. I think for me, fandom is just anybody who's excited about something to the point where it moves you. You have an inordinate amount of activity around it. So you can be in a fashion and collect shoes. You can be a foodie and go to, offbeat, restaurants. You could be a fan of like your local bartender and, Thursday nights, that's the only place you go to because you're a fan of that person and you enjoy the conversation. So I think fandom in that way, you just really like something, you like talking about it, you like exploring it, you like sharing it with other people. But I think one of the biggest things that, I think a lot of people agree on is there's an identity piece, right? So even like that local bartender, it's like, oh, you're a fan of so and so. I love when they're there too. Like we should hang out, when they're there. So I think that to me is really like what drives fandom.
I love everything that you've just said, and it sparks so many questions. And one is, I think about when you talk about identity, and of course, I tell people all the time, I wrote my thesis back in the late 90s, my college thesis on identity politics, and self versus other, and the ways in which we identify. And we create these kind of tribes, right? Whether those are based on the color of our skin or our ethnic heritage or our religious heritage or our class or our education. There's so many, or our gender or our sexuality.
Black shirts. We're a black shirt tribe right now.
We're the black shirt tribe. We
We
coordinated.
both worked in marketing and advertising, so
Exactly. And those things that define us, in some way, or that we identify with, that bartender is a great example. In some way, they create an immediate community, right? And so there's this identification of self in the other of that community. And I think one of the things at Sav Media, which I'd love to give you a chance to talk about, and Urbanime, which is your premier title under Sav Media right now, really is about this inclusivity, and of the identity, and being able to kind of tell authentic stories, in your case, that, reference the multicultural experience of America, especially for Black and Brown communities. And this is something, when we talk about the bartender, it's like it's a self-identification, but there is this othering that happens with some communities where the storytelling isn't authentically representative. So will you talk to me a little bit about how like representation and it kind of fits into this whole concept of fandom?
sure. So and I agree with you on micro tribes and how that works and how they form. One of the things I think a lot about, is those tribes, those communities, the role storytelling plays in it, the role identity plays. I think, there's a large part of communities where you have a shared belief or a shared story. If you think about Seth Godin and, tribes and, the idea that, we want to buy from brands that have the same belief as us, right? And we want to participate with other people who have the same belief as us. So I think when you think about it that way, as the heart of tribes, and you can call it different things, but that community or that group, there's storytelling that happens, right? We are this type of group. We have this type of community. We have these types of rules. If you break these types of rules, these are the things that happen. If you leave the community, these are the things, right? So story is like a really big part of that. And then the ability for story to create identity and share identity. And even as a marketing tool, right? So if you think about that community or a tribe, right, they have to grow. And story is a way that you do it. So you're saying, like, hey, we're this community, this is our belief set, this is what we want to do. If you have the same thing, you should join us, right? So you can see that connection between community, storytelling, and then identity. And so the better you get at that storytelling, the more you can attract more people, to your group. And that's before you put any, socioeconomics, ethnicity, race and politics. From what I've seen, that's just kind of how things work. I, originally was a big comic book fan and a big hip hop fan, and then I worked in skateboarding industry out in California. I worked on Osiris shoes during the heyday, if anybody remembers, like the Storm DVD and the D3 and the Moon Boot. So I was working out there, and I was like, oh, this is like really interesting. And I didn't have the words for it at the time. I didn't call it cultural anthropology. I was just like, hey, I'm a comic book fan, big, fan of that. I'm a hip hop fan, as we would say back in the day, I'm a hip hop head. And like all these skate kids are the exact same, right? It's like, but replace skating or replace comics with skating, but there's still like these groups and these subgroups and likes and dislikes. And if you break a rule, you get in trouble. And here's the way that we express, what we like and what we're into with that. So I think, when you think of it that way, that's a lot of what happens in all those groups. Story is a big part of that. Storytelling is a big way that you kind of say who you are and talk about what you're doing. And so that's why I think it's really important to understand this idea of fandom really just from a marketing communications brand strategy, right? Like it's something that you can use, you can lean into, or it's something that's happening that if you're like, oh, I don't really understand why this is working, there's culture-based marketing, but then are you having a conversation with your fandom? Have you thought about your fans? Are you thinking about how they're talking about your brand? And then, like I said, you can layer other things into it. So if you're thinking about Black and brown audiences, the communities that they're creating, the storytelling that they have, the fandom that they have, either around your brand, around culture, around themselves, are you interacting with that and how are you doing so? How are you thinking about it?
Well, there are lots of threads that I can pull on in what you've just said. I want to think about this from a marketing perspective first and foremost, even though it's not, but as a marketer, you've brought it back to that time and again. And this is in some ways about the marketing funnel, which is really when you get down to the bottom of the marketing funnel, there's a loyalty and an advocacy element. And that's kind of the realm of fandom, right? I mean, one could replace loyalty and advocacy in the in the brand pyramid with this idea of fandom. And so when you're a brand and you're trying to communicate or build a fan base, or and you think about a sports franchise, or you think about hip hop artists, you think about Beyonce right now with the new album that she just released, for instance. There is a fan base that has been cultivated. The bigger the name, the bigger the franchise, obviously, the bigger the input into your marketing funnel. So therefore, the bigger the loyal and advocate base is. But that fandom, if you are speaking to them, they are really on that audience targeting, just again to marketing again, they are your aspiration, right? They are your everything. And they're the ones who influence otherwise. So when you think about fandom in that sense, whether it's about a shoe brand or a booze brand or a way of life, a culture, as we're talking about through Urbanime, for instance, right? This is really, I think, if I'm understanding you correctly, the heart of how you're thinking about fandom. It's about cultivating community.
Yeah, I would agree. I think it's, that community and identity piece again, those three things, how they relate to one another. I was looking at a little bit about fandom. There's kind of this, and fandom is very big in sports. The sports community understands it very well, taking that person who may be like a casual, consumer of sports and really trying to turn them into a heavy consumer, just to use a lot of marketing jargon. But you're really trying to take someone from awareness to attraction to attachment to allegiance. And from what I understand with sports, you're trying to get someone to go from I watch a game to a little bit to say like, I am I worked with the Bulls, so I am a Bulls fan. That is my identity. So taking someone from, hey, basketball is okay, or I only watch basketball with my friends and it's a social thing, to eventually saying like, I am a Bulls person. This is part of my identity. This community or this tribe, is how I see the world. And so to your point, with SAV Media, we're a collective of Black and Brown owned media companies. We're really focused on comic books as a way to have a conversation with the Black and Brown community. We think of comics as this really incredible conversation that you can have. So for us, comics is more than just a publication. We think of it as comics experiences or transmedia, or there's a lot of different terms, 360, omni-channel, but just this kind of multiple touch point that you can do, and having a comic book at the center of that. And so if you think about that comic book, not only is it telling a story, but it's expressing identity, it's talking about values. You get to, learn from a story. That group gets to have something that it can express itself, market itself with, right? So if you have a really cool comic book, I'm a Spider-Man fan. I like other Spider-Man fans most of the time, unless they're too into Clone Wars, and then we have a problem. And if you know that, great. If not, it just talks about how things kind of break down into the various levels of fandom. But that's to say, there are a lot of opportunities therein. And so with Urbanime, which is my imprint inside of the collective,
And it's
we're
spectacular.
really focused. Thank you. So we're really focused on comic books as a way to express and tell stories of Black and Brown audiences and the culture itself. So a lot of times when you hear, someone say the culture, sometimes they'll mean hip hop, sometimes they'll mean urban, but it's really this idea of this kind of cultural output of, lived Black and Brown experiences. And one of the things that we did early on was to figure out, we can make up heroes, but there are also heroes in the community itself. And one thing that we know about urban culture in the community is that, we like being fans of things, right? Like we like being into stuff, we like brands, but we're also a fan of ourselves, right? Like we're a fan of our culture, we're a fan of our heroes. And so as we started pulling those things together, we saw this really tremendous opportunity where it's like, hey, as we launch and as we start, what if we focus on being fans of the culture itself and what we call out the box urban fandom, where we just kind of connect the dots. So if you are into, let's say, hip hop, and we're trying to do something about science because comic books speak well to science with powers, gadgets, cool technology, then that gives us the ability to have a conversation about Grandmaster Flash, how he invented the crossfader, how he was most likely, kind of like a technology nerd, right? And then he was into science. So in that moment, we've connected so many different communities. So you could enter that from a STEM standpoint or an engineering standpoint. You could discover Grandmaster Flash, and then at that moment, you could have a connection to old school hip hop, or vice versa. You could be an old school hip hop fan. You could really want to hear more of this story, but then it connects you to this larger world of STEM. And so, as you can see, that storytelling, that idea of community, that idea of fandom is something that we really like to leverage a lot at Urbanime, and then really across the collective as I work with the different brands and storytelling.
Again, there's so many threads to pull on. I want to look at a couple of things. One is when you just mentioned all of those references, right? Again, you come back to your original roots. What you said is like kind of cultural anthropology. And this is when there's a lot of talk right now about representation in front of and behind the screen, right?
Yep.
In media. And you talk about transmedia, I know a lot. And in this case, transmedia is that omni-media, it's multiple touch points, it's enveloping an audience or an audience of singular.
And I would even push back to marketers and say it's already the world that people live in.
Absolutely.
It's your opportunity to think about how you can be part of it. one of the things I say is your grandma, we're all transmedia producers, we're all transmedia consumers. Your grandmother's a transmedia producer. The moment she sends you a text about the family getting together, posts pictures of the baby that just got born online, gives you a call, and then like something, your mom, or your grandma is a
Yep.
transmedia producer. And so as communicators, whether you're a marketing communicator or storytelling communicator, this is the world that we all live in. And so how are you embracing it? Or what parts of it are you choosing to focus on while still having a context of that's where we live?
And I think it's great. It's a great point, because of course, transmedia, omnimedia, whatever, is like, it's here, as you just pointed out, it's already here. But it is the way in which, of course, brands, again, whether you are a movie franchise, and I think about like Halle Berry being the new Little Mermaid, and the talk that there is about, representation in the princess world, for young girls, for instance. I think about like the whole Game of Thrones franchise that exists right now and what's happening there, or the Lord of the Rings, or the DC Comics, or the Marvel, or whatever. There are these universes, right, that exist, many of which come out of comics or animation, which is interesting. And perhaps because there is such an opportunity for that cultural reference that you talked about, actually, in Urbanime and in all of the storytelling that Sav Media's kind of collective is putting together. So I'm curious, as we think about fandom, coming back to the future of fandom, we know it's omnimedia. We know it's much more inclusive, if we will. You talk a lot about geek media or nerd media, and even like, how do we do that? Is all fandom in some ways innately nerdy or geeky? Because if you're a fan, you're like that deep in it. Do you like, what do you think is like, is that innate to it? And is that part of the future? Is that we all kind of start self-identifying as nerds?
I always say everybody's a nerd about something. You just have to talk to somebody long enough to find out what they're nerdy about, right? Like if you're a sports fans and you're talking stats, you're a nerd. You just might be a little bit more popular because your thing is more mainstream. And I get to rub it in a little bit. It used to be more mainstream, and now Marvel's like the biggest thing ever. So props to Marvel. But I think that we're all fans about something, and I think it's finding what that fandom is, and does that work for you, as someone who's into marketing communication. I think as far as representation goes, I think there's a lot of opportunities for brands to have this conversation, see that transmedia or that omni-channel or that 360. Where's that person in the middle? How are they having these conversations? What are they talking about? What are they fans of, right? It is definitely more complex. It's more rewarding. I look at it as the multiverse, right? So I might be kind of into something over here that has its own kind of immersiveness to it, but I might be deeper over here. But you can also talk to me across multiple things that I'm into. And, I feel bad for channel planners and,
As
people
we get
who are
into the
like,
metaverse now too, right?
right. And yeah, and people who are context marketers or content strategists. But, it's just kind of the reality that we live in. But I think, understanding that there is an opportunity with fandom to talk to whomever you're talking to is there. And as far as representation goes, I think one of the things we talk a lot about at SAV and Urbanime is it's actually not representation. I think what we're really looking at is misrepresentation. I think a lot of times when you're, a Black audience or a brown audience, and there is good representation. So I'm not going to say that there's not, but, oftentimes it's like, that's not how I would have said that, or that's not really coming from, my culture or my community or my lived experience. And so I think what you're going to see more and more of is Black and brown audiences finding these worlds, finding these fandoms that they can be part of, or fandoms that they are the center of because of the communities that they're in, and spending more time there. And so as any communication professional, you just have to do your homework. I talk a lot about the peer wall, which is the wall that you have to earn your way through. Back in the day with the, TV industrial complex, you could just put an ad out, people will watch it. Now, you've got to get through memes, you've got to get through snaps, you've got to get through TikToks, right? And you have to literally earn your way through. So my question to anyone who is communicating is, how are you earning your way through that peer wall? And I definitely think fandom is one of the ways to do it. I definitely think this kind of omni-channel storytelling is one way to do it. So for instance, if we were to do a partnership with, let's say JVC or, electronic, goods company, right? In
Stereo
that
equipment.
space, stereo equipment, right? Imagine the conversation that you now get to have with that idea about Grandmaster Flash, right? So imagine if you're JBL, we could talk about the history of JBL speakers in the Black community, and with hip hop, we could talk about the legacy of Black innovators. We could also talk about the Black community not getting to own their IPs. And then you could have a CSR play where, as JBL, maybe you help people get patents. Look at how you've become part of that world in an instant, just as one company in one moment with one piece of storytelling with representation, because now you're having that community tell their
And
story.
you're educating. I think one thing, and we're at time, so I want to wrap up, but one thing that you've just mentioned that I think was a key part of the work that we did together also, which is, to your point, it's not about representation or even overcoming misrepresentation. It's not about the nerd culture, but this fandom idea, and that we started here, which is kind of that identity and community, is about uplifting, right? And kind of like building towards a shared future. And what you just mentioned with like the JBL example, hypothetical example, is that in fact, there is an educational element and a building of a bridge between these different cultures, these different communities, these different identities, and building a fan base out of that actually affirms. I think affirmation is a big piece.
Yeah.
It's affirming to the identity of those fans. So is that maybe what we could end on, Chris? Like, would you agree or disagree?
And I would say and I would say yes, and even tapping into that fan base, right? Like there's a fan base of hip hop music, but inside of that, there's a fan base of JBL, right? And so I think it gives you the ability to do these things, right? And I would even push the idea of uplifting. I would say uplifting in the sense, especially for brands, to be a platform where other people get to tell their story. And the role that brands can play, especially in this new world, is not being the protagonist. I know a lot of times at agencies, it's like, oh, how do we make you be the hero? And it's like, you can be the hero by not being the hero, by being the sidekick, by understanding that everybody is the hero in their own lives, and that you get to be that trusted person along the way. And then if you can use your resources to uplift those stories in that way, give that space, give that platform,
you create
share those
a fan
channels.
base that feels loyal and authentic to you in that way.
Yeah. And my favorite example is Lego, right? Lego had this amazing community of older builders who loved Lego, never got past it, and Lego didn't know what to do with it for a long time, but they're like, we're not going to touch it. We know it's there. We're focused on kids. And I forget their name, but one person was like, hey, I have a plan on how to work with this community. And that's where the Lego professional builder set came about. And they really leaned into that fandom. And look at how it's transformed the company.
Totally transformed the company. I love that example. And I love Lego as a closing for fandom, because it certainly has stood the test of time. Chris Walker of Sav Media and Urbanime, thank you for joining us on Future of XYZ to talk about the future of fandom. It's totally fascinating, and we just scratched the surface.
Definitely. And it's good to see you again too.
Always good to see you. Everyone watching or listening, check out Urbanime. Chris, where's the best place to see it? On Instagram probably is my favorite.
Yeah, I think Instagram has a lot of good stuff from us. So it's URBANIME. So like Urban IME. So Urbanime. And then you can go to savmedia.com, SAVVMEDIE, savmedia.com to see the collective. And then you can also go to urbanime.com. And, we have some of our things that we call a mixtape, which are comic book magazines. So if you can imagine like a culture magazine, but instead of photography, we use comic book illustrations to tell the stories and have original comics. And then, there's a lot of stuff there. We have original comics as well. So
I love it. It's truly beautiful work. And it talks to all the things that we've talked about in fandom today. Anyone watching or listening who doesn't already subscribe, make sure you do. You can do it at YouTube if you prefer video, or anywhere you get your podcast if you prefer to listen to audio. You can also, of course, make sure that you visit future-of.xyz or follow us on Instagram. We look forward to doing it again soon. And thank you for joining us. Chris, again.
For sure. Thanks for having me.